October 30th, 1999. For the first time in 28 years, Carlos Santana stands at the top of the Billboard 200 chart. The gap between number one albums is the longest in music history. He's 52 years old. Record labels had called him too old, washed up, irrelevant. But on this autumn Saturday, his 18th studio album, Supernatural, dethrones both Britney Spears and the Backstreet Boys. Within weeks, it will sell over 500,000 copies in 7 days. By February, it will tie Michael Jackson's Grammy record with 9 wins in a single night. By decade's end, it will become the 9th best-selling album of the 2000s, despite being released in 1999. The story of Supernatural isn't just about a comeback. It's about a Mexican-born guitarist who went from playing Tijuana strip clubs to defining an era at Woodstock, then spent 30 years chasing spiritual enlightenment while his career crumbled, only to return with an album that would sell 30 million copies and change the rules of the music industry forever. This is the story of how one man, one visionary producer, and one impossible collaboration defied every expectation and created the greatest comeback in music history. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Carlos Santana's resurrection. Before Santana became synonymous with supernatural success, before the Grammys and the platinum records, there was a 7-year-old boy in Autlán de Navarro, Mexico, learning violin from his father. Carlos Humberto Santana Barragán was born on July 20, 1947, into a family where music wasn't a choice. It was survival. His father was a mariachi musician, a fourth-generation player who understood that in Mexico your guitar could feed your family better than your hands could farm. Young Carlos learned violin first, then guitar at 8, absorbing everything from mariachi to the blues records that drifted across the border on American radio waves. In 1955, the Santana family moved to Tijuana, that border city where two worlds collided. By his teenage years, Carlos was playing strip clubs along the Avenida Revolucion, earning money while watching American sailors and Mexican locals lose themselves in music and tequila. He was exposed to B.B. King, Little Richard, and Ray Charles, sounds that would shape everything he'd become. Then in 1960, the family moved to San Francisco's Mission District. Carlos graduated from Mission High School in 1965, accepted to California State University and Humboldt State, but turned them both down. He had a different education in mind. He discovered the city's exploding music scene, where rock and roll was mutating into something stranger, more psychedelic, more open. In 1966, Carlos formed the Santana Blues Band with friends from the street music scene. Keyboardist Greg Rowley, bassist David Brown. They played small clubs around the Bay Area, developing a sound that blended Afro-Latin rhythms with blues rock guitar, something nobody had quite heard before. It was aggressive but spiritual, ancient but futuristic. It didn't fit any category, which meant it probably wouldn't go anywhere. Then Bill Graham heard them play. Graham, the legendary promoter who ran the Fillmore Auditorium, saw something in Santana's band. More importantly, he saw an opportunity. In 1969, he was helping book talent for a massive festival in upstate New York, something called Woodstock. He convinced the organizers to give this unknown band from San Francisco a slot. The band had just signed with Columbia Records and were still recording their debut album. They were nobodies. Graham told them, "This is your shot. If you do this right, you'll be as big as anyone in rock." They didn't believe him. August 16, 1969, 2:00 p.m. Santana arrived at Woodstock expecting to play much later, close to midnight. Carlos had accepted mescaline from Grateful Dead guitarist Jerry Garcia hours earlier, figuring he had time for it to wear off. He was wrong. Suddenly, the band was being rushed on stage. Carlos was peaking on the hallucinogen. The neck of his Gibson SG Special felt like a snake in his hands. The crowd of hundreds of thousands looked like a kaleidoscope. In his own words, "I was like, oh my God, am I going to be able to play? I can't even touch my nose." He closed his eyes and prayed. The prayer was simple. "God, if you help me right now, I won't poop my pants in front of everybody." Then they hit the first notes of Soul Sacrifice. What happened next changed music history. For 11 minutes, Santana delivered a performance so electrifying, so otherworldly, that nobody who witnessed it could talk about anything else. The Afro-Latin percussion drove like a heartbeat. Carlos's guitar screamed and sang. The crowd went from sitting to standing to dancing, an entire generation moving as one organism. When the Woodstock film was released 5 months later, that performance of Soul Sacrifice became iconic. Their debut album, released days after Woodstock, shot to number 4 on the Billboard charts. Evil Ways became a top 10 hit. Their second album, Abraxas, hit number 1 in 1970. Black Magic Woman reached number 4. A third album, Santana III, went to number 1 in 1971. Bill Graham had been right. They were as big as anyone in rock, but Carlos Santana wasn't interested in being a rock star. In 1972, Carlos discovered spiritual teacher Sri Chinmoy. He began meditating for hours, changed his name to Devadip, and started making music that prioritized enlightenment over entertainment. Albums like Caravanserai confused Columbia Records. It was essentially a vocals-free experimental jazz record. Label president Clive Davis called it career suicide. But Santana didn't care about hits, he cared about transcendence. Throughout the 70s and 80s, Santana's sound became more esoteric, more jazz fusion, more spiritual. Albums like Love, Devotion, Surrender, and Lotus were critical successes but commercial disappointments. The audiences that had danced at Woodstock were now in their 30s and 40s, raising families, listening to softer rock. Santana's Latin jazz spiritual fusion felt increasingly out of step with the times. By 1991, when his Columbia Records deal ended, Santana was in free fall. The next 2 albums on Polydor Island, Milagro in 1992 and Sacred Fire in 1993, barely registered. Milagro peaked at number 102 on the charts. Santana hadn't had a top 40 hit in 17 years. He was playing nostalgia circuits, county fairs, casino lounges. Then came the financial reckoning. Carlos's wife Deborah discovered that he was owed over $4 million in unpaid royalties. Trapped in a lopsided contract with legal bills that would consume whatever they could recover. Her husband, one of the most celebrated guitarists in rock history, was essentially broke. She spent a year teaching herself the music business, fired everyone in Carlos's management team, and took control of his career. Carlos later admitted, "I'd probably be a hobo if not for her." By the mid-90s, record labels weren't interested. When Santana and his team approached several companies, they were told he was too old, too niche, too 70s. The music industry had moved on. Alternative rock, grunge, hip-hop, and teen pop dominated the charts. There was no space for a 50-year-old Latin rock guitarist who meditated and talked about angels. But Deborah remembered someone from their past. Clive Davis. In 1995, Carlos participated in a documentary about Davis, who had originally signed Santana to Columbia in 1969. Deborah encouraged Carlos to approach Davis about a possible deal with Arista Records. It was a long shot. Davis was now focused on hitmakers like Whitney Houston and TLC. Why would he want to resurrect a has-been? But Davis saw something others didn't. He saw Carlos perform live and was reminded of why he'd signed him 30 years earlier. The guitar playing was still transcendent. The stage presence was still magnetic. What was missing was modern production, contemporary voices, and radio-friendly songs. Davis made an offer. He would sign Santana to Arista, but with conditions. This album would be built for radio. It would feature collaborations with younger contemporary artists. Half the album would be vintage Santana, the Latin percussion, the soaring guitar. The other half would be pop songs designed to dominate the charts. Carlos hesitated. He'd spent 30 years rejecting commercialism, but he also recognized an opportunity. He cited Miles Davis and John Coltrane. Both had successfully shifted toward pop later in their careers without losing their artistic integrity. He agreed. In early 1997, recording began. The album was initially titled Mumbo Jumbo. Creating Supernatural was like assembling a puzzle where none of the pieces seemed to fit. Davis and A&R executive Pete Gunbarg began reaching out to artists looking for collaborations. They wanted a mix. Established legends like Eric Clapton, contemporary rock stars like Dave Matthews and Rob Thomas, hip-hop innovators like Lauryn Hill and Wyclef Jean, and R&B voices like CeeLo Green. But there was a problem. Most of these artists had never heard of Santana. The product G&B, the duo who would sing on Maria Maria, later admitted they asked, "Who the hell is that?" when introduced to Carlos. Carlos himself was uncertain. At one point, Gunbarg played him an early demo of a song that would become Smooth. Santana hated it. He thought it sounded too much like his 1971 song, Guajira. He didn't want to repeat himself. Gunbarg went to Clive Davis for help. Davis had to personally call Carlos and tell him, "This is a hit. Trust me." Santana finally agreed to record it, but insisted it be done live in one take to preserve authenticity. They brought in producer Matt Serletic, who had worked with Matchbox 20, and recorded it at a studio in San Francisco. Rob Thomas later recalled, "As soon as I heard it, even when I was in the middle of the song, I was like, man, this song is big." But Smooth almost didn't have Rob Thomas on vocals. The song began as Room 17, written by Ital Shur. It was about two people having a secret rendezvous in a hotel room, essentially a groupie song. Gunbarg loved the instrumental but told Shur the lyrics would never work for Santana, a spiritual family man. He connected Shur with Thomas, who had just finished touring with Matchbox 20. Thomas rewrote the lyrics entirely, keeping Shur's melody but creating new imagery about a Spanish Harlem Mona Lisa. He recorded a demo intending it for another singer. He originally envisioned George Michael singing it. But when Santana heard Thomas's demo, he insisted, "I want this guy." Meanwhile, Wyclef Jean was crafting Maria Maria by sampling a Wu-Tang Clan beat and recruiting the product G&B to sing. Lauryn Hill, fresh off her 5 Grammy sweep for The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, contributed Do You Like the Way. Dave Matthews wrote Love of My Life, adapting Brahms' Symphony No. 3. The album was becoming a patchwork of styles, voices, and visions, which is exactly what Davis wanted. But it also meant the album had no cohesive identity. Critic Stephen Thomas Erlewine would later write that Supernatural never develops a consistent voice that holds the album together and was directionless. By May 1999, the album was finished. 13 tracks, 13 different producers, multiple languages, styles ranging from Latin jazz to hip-hop to alternative rock to blues. Arista planned an initial shipment of 125,000 copies. As word of mouth grew, they increased it to 210,000. By early June, it had jumped to 350,000. On June 15, 1999, Supernatural was released. Supernatural debuted at number 19 on the Billboard 200 in early July 1999. Respectable but hardly revolutionary. For an artist who'd been out of the spotlight for so long, 19 was actually impressive. Then, Smooth started climbing. Radio programmers had been given advance copies. The song started getting airplay on multiple formats: pop, rock, Latin, adult contemporary. It worked everywhere. By late May, before the official June 15th release date, some stations had leaked it and were playing it in regular rotation. By October 23, 1999, Smooth hit number 1 on the Hot 100. It would stay there for 12 consecutive weeks, the longest-running #1 single of 1999. It was the last #1 song of the millennium and the first #1 of the new century when it continued its reign into January 2000. 1 week later, on October 30th, Supernatural hit #1 on the album chart. It was Santana's first chart-topping album since 1971, a 28-year gap, the longest in music history according to Guinness World Records. The album sold 169,000 copies that week, then 183,000, then 189,000. Its highest single-week sale came in late December, 527,000 copies. After the holiday season, it sold 583,000 in 1 week. After the Grammys in February 2000, it sold another 441,000. By then, Smooth had been joined by a second chart topper, Maria Maria, which hit #1 in April 2000 and stayed there for 10 weeks. Supernatural eventually spent 12 non-consecutive weeks at #1, finally dethroned by NSYNC's No Strings Attached, which sold 2.4 million copies in its first week. The critical reception was mixed. Some praised the album's ambition and the quality of Santana's guitar work. Others felt it was too calculated, too dependent on guest stars, more of a compilation album than a cohesive artistic statement. Rolling Stone's David Wild noted that not everything worked, calling Do You Like the Way with Lauryn Hill a bit more forced. But audiences didn't care about cohesion. They cared that Smooth was irresistible, that Maria Maria made them dance, that Carlos Santana's guitar still sounded like liquid fire. In 11 countries, Supernatural hit #1. It was certified 15 times platinum in the United States. Global sales would eventually exceed 30 million copies, making it the best-selling album by a Hispanic artist in music history and one of the best-selling albums of all time. Carlos Santana, written off as irrelevant just 5 years earlier, had created the biggest album of his 50-year career. February 23, 2000, the 42nd Annual Grammy Awards. Carlos Santana walks to the stage for the first time that evening to accept Best Pop Collaboration with vocals for Smooth. He returns moments later for Best Pop Instrumental Performance for El Farol. Then Best Rock Performance by a duo or group with vocal for Put Your Lights On. Then Best Rock Instrumental Performance for The Calling. He keeps walking back and forth, retrieving awards like a dog fetching frisbees. By his own admission, I kept making fun of it. I felt like a doggy retrieving a frisbee. Then come the big ones. Best Rock Album. Record of the Year for Smooth. Though that award technically goes to Rob Thomas and Ital Shure as the songwriters. And finally, presented by Bob Dylan and Lauryn Hill, Album of the Year. As he walks to the stage for that final award, Dylan keeps pointing at him, giving him a look Carlos describes as a divine rascal look with a lot of empathy. They'd toured together twice, once in 1983-84, once in 1995. But Carlos had never seen that expression before. Supernatural wins 9 Grammy Awards total. 8 for Santana directly, 9 if you count Smooth as a song. It ties Michael Jackson's Thriller for most Grammys won by a single album in one night. Carlos becomes the first Hispanic artist to win Album of the Year. Months later, at the inaugural Latin Grammy Awards, Supernatural wins 3 more. Record of the Year for Corazón Espinado, Best Rock Instrumental for El Farol, and Best Rock Performance by a duo or group with vocal. The impact wasn't just about awards. Supernatural proved that cross-generational, cross-genre collaboration could work on a massive scale. Before this album, the idea of pairing a 52-year-old Latin rock guitarist with a 20-something alternative rock singer seemed absurd. After Supernatural, it became a blueprint. The album showed that artists could reinvent themselves at any age. Carlos Santana was older than most radio programmers' target demographic, but Smooth dominated every format. Age wasn't a barrier, it was an asset, bringing credibility and depth to contemporary sounds. It also arrived at a perfect cultural moment. Time magazine's cover story from May 1999 declared, "Latin music goes pop," featuring Ricky Martin, Jennifer Lopez, Christina Aguilera, Enrique Iglesias, Marc Anthony, and Gloria Estefan were all experiencing breakthrough success. Supernatural rode that wave while also transcending it. This wasn't just a Latin artist having a moment. This was a rock legend proving he'd never left. Billboard later noted that if Michael Jackson's 1984 Grammy sweep had dramatized what was possible when you dominate the music world, Santana's 2000 sweep showed that talented artists could succeed at any age. At 52, Carlos was more than twice Jackson's age when he won his 8 Grammys. By decade's end, Supernatural was ranked as the 9th best-selling album of the 2000s, despite being released in 1999. Smooth was ranked the number 2 song of all time on Billboard's Hot 100 60th anniversary list, trailing only The Weeknd's Blinding Lights and Chubby Checker's The Twist. The album's success generated a massively successful world tour. Carlos performed at venues he hadn't headlined in decades to audiences that spanned 3 generations. Reviewing a 2000 Hollywood Bowl show, critics noted, "Santana and his big band showed its most ferocious side, creating an intense musical stew that anchors itself in the timeless power of Afro-Cuban percussion." But not everyone celebrated Supernatural's triumph. Critics who'd followed Santana's career for decades felt betrayed. This wasn't the Carlos who had played Woodstock, the guitarist who'd spent the 70s and 80s pushing boundaries and rejecting commercialism. This was Carlos as a guest on his own album, his guitar relegated to supporting role behind pop singers. The AV Club later wrote, "Supernatural cut Santana off from the rest of his career. If you cared about Santana before Supernatural, you were precisely the audience that Supernatural was intended not to reach." Jazz purists argued that Santana had sold out, trading his artistic integrity for a Grammy sweep and a pile of money. They pointed to the album's lack of cohesion, the way it felt more like a marketing strategy than an organic creative vision. There was also the question of authorship. How much of Supernatural was actually Carlos Santana? The songs were written by others. The vocals were performed by others. The production was handled by 13 different producers. Carlos played guitar, brilliantly, undeniably. But was he the album's author or just a highly skilled session musician on his own record? Even Clive Davis's role became controversial. Some argued that Davis had saved Santana, resurrecting a dying career. Others argued that Davis had exploited Santana, using his name and guitar to sell an album that was essentially a pop compilation featuring various artists, with Santana as the thread connecting them. Carlos himself seemed conflicted. In interviews, he alternated between embracing the album's commercial success and defending its artistic merit. He told Rolling Stone, "I'm proud to be able to demonstrate to people that deepness and class can be as profitable as shallowness and crass. This validates the idea that quality and quantity can go together." But he also acknowledged the calculation behind it. When asked about the collaborations, he admitted, "Supernatural was never meant to be star-studded at first, but the songs really dictated different singers and different musicians. There were also murmurs about the album's Grammy sweep. Some industry insiders suggested that Arista's aggressive campaigning, combined with the feel-good narrative of a 52-year-old legend's comeback, had influenced voters. The Grammys had always been susceptible to narratives, and Supernatural's story was irresistible. Additionally, some noted that several of the categories Santana won in 2000 have since been consolidated. If the 2000 Grammy categories were applied using today's structure, Santana would have won fewer awards. By contrast, Michael Jackson's 8 Grammys for Thriller would likely have been 9 under today's structure. But perhaps the deepest controversy was philosophical. What did Supernatural's success say about the music industry and popular taste? Was it a triumph of artistry and reinvention? Or was it proof that, in the late 1990s, the music industry had become so focused on marketability that even legends had to conform to commercial formulas to survive? 25 years later, Supernatural remains one of the most successful albums in music history. 15 times platinum in the United States, 30 million copies sold worldwide, 9 Grammy Awards, #1 in 11 countries. In 2025, it was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame. Official recognition that the album had become a permanent part of music history. But the album's legacy is complicated. For casual listeners and pop fans, Supernatural is a masterpiece. A collection of undeniable hits that bridged generations and genres. Smooth remains ubiquitous, playing on radio stations, in grocery stores, at weddings and barbecues. It's become part of the cultural wallpaper, the soundtrack to the turn of the millennium. For Santana purists, Supernatural is a betrayal. The moment Carlos traded his artistic soul for commercial success. They point to his earlier albums, Abraxas, Caravanserai, Lotus, as his true legacy, and see Supernatural as a footnote, an asterisk, a moment of weakness. For the music industry, Supernatural became a template. The guest star-studded album, once rare, became commonplace. Artists from Santana to Herbie Hancock to Willie Nelson began releasing collaboration albums, pairing their legacy status with contemporary hitmakers. Some worked, most didn't. None matched Supernatural's success. Carlos Santana himself has released 9 more studio albums since Supernatural, including Shaman in 2002 and Sentient in 2024. None have come close to matching Supernatural's commercial success. Shaman went triple platinum and produced the hit The Game of Love with Michelle Branch, but it felt like an attempt to recapture lightning in a bottle. The question remains, was Supernatural a singular, unrepeatable moment? Or was it proof that artists can reinvent themselves at any age? The answer is probably both. Supernatural succeeded because of a perfect storm of factors. Carlos Santana's undeniable guitar mastery, Clive Davis's strategic vision, Pete Ganbarg's A&R instincts, Rob Thomas's songwriting, the cultural moment of Latin music's mainstream breakthrough, and the feel-good narrative of a legend's return. You couldn't replicate that if you tried. Carlos Santana once said, "This album belongs with something people need every day in their lives: air, water, and sex. You can have food, granola, or whatever. But basically, air for your lungs, water for your body, and sex for your psyche." It's a bold claim, but maybe that's exactly what Supernatural became. Not a masterpiece in the traditional sense, but a cultural phenomenon that transcended art, commerce, and criticism. It was joy distilled into 75 minutes of music. It was proof that music could still surprise us, still unite us, still matter. At the 2000 Grammys, Carlos reflected on what the success meant to him. He thanked Bill Graham, the promoter who'd put him on the Woodstock stage 30 years earlier. He thanked Clive Davis, who'd believed in him when nobody else would. And he thanked his father, who'd taught him violin in that small Mexican village a lifetime ago. "When I look at those trophies," Carlos later said, "I think of how they went out of their way to connect me with B.B. King and Tito Puente. They're the ones who opened the door for me in many ways. They made me the voice for the voiceless, all the dishwashers, all the people who clean sheets, clean toilets, pick the food, all those people you never see unless you want to ask them to stick around for 2 more hours to babysit your kids." Supernatural wasn't just Carlos Santana's comeback. It was a love letter to everyone who'd been told they were too old, too ethnic, too spiritual, too unmarketable. It was proof that quality, when combined with vision and timing, could still win. Whether you love the album or hate it, whether you think it's a masterpiece or a calculated commercial product, one thing is undeniable. Supernatural changed music history. In the end, Supernatural asks us to reconsider what we mean by authenticity in music. Is an album less authentic because it was designed to be commercial? Is a collaboration less valid because it was orchestrated by a record executive? Is a comeback less meaningful because it required compromise? Or is there a different kind of authenticity? The authenticity of survival, of adaptation, of refusing to accept that your story is over. Carlos Santana was 52 when Supernatural was released. He'd been playing guitar for 44 years. He'd seen his career rise, transform, and decline. He'd been worshipped and forgotten, celebrated and dismissed. He'd gone from playing Woodstock to playing county fairs. And then he did the impossible. He listened to people who told him he needed to change. He collaborated with artists who didn't know his name. He recorded songs he initially didn't believe in. He trusted a producer's vision over his own instincts. And he created one of the best-selling albums of all time. Maybe that's the real story of Supernatural, not the Grammy sweep or the sales figures, but the humility required to start over, to let go of who you were so you could become something new. At Woodstock in 1969, Carlos Santana played while peaking on mescaline, his guitar neck writhing like a snake in his hands. He prayed just to stay in time and in tune. 30 years later, at the Grammys in 2000, he stood on that stage holding 9 trophies, having set records that may never be broken. Both moments required faith. Both required letting go. Both required trust that something larger than himself was guiding the music. Maybe that's what makes Supernatural supernatural. Not the sales, not the Grammys, not the comeback narrative, but the leap of faith required to make it happen. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Carlos Santana's, prove that it's never too late to write a new chapter.